Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at a name most of us probably heard back in school science class.
Gregor Mendel.
Exactly. But his story is so much more than just pea plants, right? We're doing a deep dive into his life, his work, the times he lived in, using the material we've looked at.
That's right. We want to go beyond, the simple discoveries and understand the man himself. What was his world like? The cultural backdrop, the political situation.
Yeah.
It all feeds into his journey.
And it's a journey with some, let's say, surprising twists, even some controversy that still gets talked about today. So let's start right at the beginning. Where does his story kick off?
Okay, so we start in 1822. He was born Johann Mendel Gregor, came later in a little farming village, Heinzendorf.
Heinzendorf. And where was that exactly?
That was in Silesia, which back then was part of the Austrian Empire. His family, the Mendels, they were newcomers. They had been working the same farm for well over a century.
Wow, really rooted in the land then. Anton and Rosine were his parents, and he had sisters.
Yep. An older sister, Veronica, and a younger one, Teresa. And yeah, that connection to the land showed up early. He was apparently working as a gardener, even studied beekeeping as a kid. Little hints of where his interests would lead,
Early signs. But getting an education wasn't straightforward for him, was it?
No, not at all. He managed to attend gymnasium in Troppau and then the Philosophical Institute in Olomouc, but he hit some roadblocks. He had periods of illness that forced him to take time off.
And money was tight, too.
Oh, definitely. That seems to have been a constant struggle. Paying for his studies was really difficult. In fact, his younger sister, Teresa, she actually gave him her dowry to help him out.
That's incredible family support.
It really is. And it seems he remembered that. Later on, he helped support Teresa's own sons while they studied to become doctors. Sort of paying it forward, you could say.
It really shows how much that financial pressure weighed on him, and it actually pushed him towards his next big life decision, didn't it?
It did. He explicitly mentioned wanting to escape the perpetual anxiety about a means of livelihood. So his solution was to, join a monastery, to become a monk.
Which sounds maybe a bit odd to us now, thinking of a scientist.
Well, yeah, but back then, certain monasteries, especially the Augustinians he joined, were real centers of learning. They offered, intellectual community and financial security.
So it was a practical move as much as anything.
Seems like it. So it's 1843, he enters the Augustinian St. Thomas's Abbey in Brno-Brunn, as it was known then, and that's when Johann becomes Gregor.
And this wasn't just any quiet place for prayer, right? It had a scientific leaning.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The Abbey actually had a history of scientific interest. The head of natural history and agriculture there, a guy named Johann Karl Nessler, was already doing research into heredity, using sheep.
Interesting. So the ground was fertile, so to speak.
Exactly. And Mendel's own physics teacher from Olomouc, Friedrich Franz, was the one who recommended the Abbey, knowing about this environment.
So he lands in this intellectually stimulating place, but his path, even there, wasn't smooth sailing immediately. I heard he had trouble with teaching.
He did, yeah. It's kind of ironic given his legacy. He actually failed the oral part of the teacher certification exam.
Twice.
Twice? Wow. Yeah, first in 1850, then again in 1856.
That must have stung. But someone there saw his potential.
The abbot at the time, Cyril František Knapp, he clearly recognized Mendel's intellect, despite the exam trouble. Abbot Knapp actually sponsored him to go study formally at the University of Vienna.
Ah, okay. So a chance for more rigorous training.
A crucial one.
Yeah.
From 1851 to 53. And in Vienna, he studied under some big names, like the physicist Christian Doppler.
The Doppler effect.
The very same. So Mendel got exposure to, serious quantitative methods, experimental design, stuff that would be vital later.
Right. So he comes back to the Abbey after Vienna, teaches mostly physics. Is he starting his own research yet?
He's getting there. He meets a botanist, Alexander Zawadsky, around 1854, who apparently really encouraged him to pursue his own research ideas.
And was he just stuck in Brno, or did he get out a bit?
He did travel some. There's a record of a trip to Paris and London in 1862. He visited the International Exhibition, saw some scientific sites. You have to think that kind of exposure might have broadened his perspective too.
Sure, seeing what else was happening. But then his career path takes another turn within the Abbey.
Yes, a major one. In 1867, Abbot Knapp died, and Mendel was elected to succeed him. He became the abbot.
So leader of the monastery, that sounds prestigious, but did it help his science?
Well, that's the irony. It actually ended his scientific work.
Really? Why?
The administrative duties were apparently overwhelming. And crucially, he got tangled up in this huge, draining dispute with the government. They were trying to levy these special new taxes on religious institutions, and he fought it hard.
So the very stability the abbey offered eventually consumed all his time and energy.
Pretty much. It left no room for the painstaking work his experiments required. And tragically, Mendel died in 1884, suffering from chronic kidney disease.
And there's that story about his papers.
Yeah, it's a sad footnote. The abbot who came after him reportedly burned a lot of Mendel's papers. Maybe to distance the abbey from the tax fight, maybe just clearing things out. We don't know. But you can't help but wonder what might have been lost.
Ugh, yeah. A reminder of how fragile historical records can be. But thankfully, his most crucial work did survive.
His pea plant experiment.
The famous ones. Let's dive into those. Where did he even do them?
In the monastery garden. And this wasn't just like a little vegetable patch. It was a dedicated experimental garden, about 2 hectares, a decent size.
So a proper research setup. Did he have help?
That botanist, Zawatsky, supposedly helped with the design. Although there's an anecdote that the previous abbot, Knapp, found Mendel's detailed tracking of pea family trees kind of funny. Reportedly giggled at the meticulous genealogies.
If only he knew. So why peas? What was special about them?
Good question. Peas, Pisum sativum, were a great choice. They're easy to grow, they reproduce relatively quickly, and crucially, they had these really distinct, easily observable traits that seem to be inherited in an either fashion, not blended.
And he focused on 7 of these.
That's right. Things like seed shape round or wrinkled, angular, flower color purple or white, pod shape inflated or constricted, pod color green or yellow, plant height tall or dwarf, and a couple others like seed coat color and flower position. Picking these clear binary traits was absolutely key.
And the scale of this was pretty massive, right?
So enormous, especially for one person, mostly working alone. Between roughly 1856 and 1863, he grew and tested something like 28,000 pea plants, meticulously.
28,000. Okay, let's use an example. The seed color one is classic. How did that work?
So he started with true breeding plants. That means plants that when they self-pollinate only produce offspring like themselves. So a true breeding yellow pea plant only makes yellow peas. A true breeding green one only makes green.
Okay, makes sense.
Then he'd cross them. Take pollen from a yellow one, put it on the flower of a green one, and vice versa. This first generation of offspring, the F1 generation. What do you think he got?
Well, based on blending, maybe yellowish green.
That's what most people thought back then. But no, every single pea in that F1 generation was yellow. The green trait just disappeared.
Completely vanished. Okay.
But here's the genius part. He then took those F1 plants, the yellow ones, and let them self-pollinate. And in the next generation, the F2.
The green came back.
It did. And not just randomly. It came back in a very specific, predictable ratio. For every 3 yellow peas, there was about 1 green pea. A 3-to-1 ratio. Consistently.
The famous 3-to-1 ratio. And that blew the blending idea out of the water.
Totally. Blending couldn't explain how the green reappeared or why it was in such a clear ratio. This led Mendel to his big ideas. He called the trait that showed up in F1 like yellow, dominant, and the one that vanished like green, recessive.
And he figured out there were these hidden factors.
Exactly. Invisible factors passed down from parents. Each plant had 2 factors for each trait, one from each parent. And these factors didn't blend. They stayed distinct. One could mask the other, the dominant masking the recessive.
Which explains the F1 generation. They all got a yellow factor and a green factor, but yellow was dominant, so they looked yellow.
Precisely. And then in the F2, those factors segregated, split up randomly when the F1 plants made their own pollen and eggs. So you could get combinations like 2 yellow factors or 2 green factors or 1 of each again. The math worked out to that 3-to-1 visible ratio.
This led to his laws, right? Segregation and...
Independent assortment. Segregation is the idea that the 2 factors for a trait separate during reproduction. Independent assortment is the idea that factors for different traits like seed color and seed shape are inherited independently of each other. They don't stick together.
And those factors, we call them genes now.
We do. It's incredible. And you know what's really wild? Scientists are still working on the specifics. There's a project wrapping up around 2025, they expect, that's finally pinpointing the actual specific genes on the pDNA that correspond to those 7 traits Mendel studied over 150 years ago.
Wow. Like identifying the exact gene for round versus wrinkled seeds.
Exactly. Genes with names like PSSBE1, PSSGR, connecting his observations directly to the molecular level. It just shows how fundamental his discoveries were.
So he figures all this out. This is revolutionary stuff. How did the scientific world react when he presented it?
Well, with a collective shrug, basically. He was met with almost complete silence.
Seriously, he did publish it, right?
Oh, yeah. He presented his paper, Experiments on Plant Hybridization, at 2 meetings of the local Natural History Society in Brno in 1865.
So it wasn't hidden away in a drawer?
No, he put it out there. He got a couple of mentions in local papers, but the wider scientific community,
Right.
they just didn't notice or didn't get it. When the paper was published in the Society's journal in 1866, it got filed under hybridization studies, not inheritance, and it was barely cited for like 35 years.
That's unbelievable. And Darwin never knew about it.
Nope. Charles Darwin was wrestling with the problem of heredity for his theory of evolution, but he was completely unaware of Mendel's work. It's one of those big what-ifs in science history. If Darwin had read Mendel,
Genetics and evolution might have connected decades earlier.
very likely. Even the prominent scientists Mendel corresponded with, like the botanist Carl Megeli, didn't seem to grasp the importance of what Mendel had found.
That must have been incredibly frustrating for Mendel.
You'd have to think so. The dominant idea was still this vague concept of blending inheritance. Mendel's particulate mathematical model was just too different, too radical for the time. But apparently, he had faith. He reportedly told a friend, Gustav von Niesel.
My time will come.
Exactly. Talk about foresight.
And it finally did, right? Around the turn of the century.
Yes, around 1900. In this classic story of simultaneous rediscovery, 3 scientists, Hugo de Vries in the Netherlands, Karl Correns in Germany, and Erich von Tschermak in Austria, were all independently doing hybridization experiments.
And they found the same patterns.
They did. And crucially, de Vries and Correns, at least, searched the literature and found Mendel's old paper. They realized he'd figured it all out decades earlier and gave him full credit for priority. There's some debate if Tschermak really understood the laws initially, but the other 2 definitely did.
So that independent confirmation was the key.
Absolutely. Suddenly, Mendel's work wasn't just one obscure paper, it was verified. This rediscovery kicked off the modern age of genetics.
And provided the mechanism that Darwin's theory needed.
Precisely. It showed how traits could be passed on faithfully, how variation was maintained. This essentially led, in the 1930s and 40s, to the modern synthesis of evolution, combining Darwinian selection with Mendelian genetics, thanks partly to statistical work by people like R.A. Fisher.
It really shows how science builds, sometimes with long delays. But sometimes politics gets in the way too, right?
Yeah, there was that dark period, especially in the Soviet Union under Lysenko, and also in China for a time, where Mendelian genetics was actually rejected for political reasons in favor of Lamarckian ideas. Geneticists were persecuted. It's a stark reminder that scientific acceptance isn't always straightforward.
A chilling example. Now, Mendel didn't only work with peas, did he?
No, his curiosity went further. He also did extensive experiments with hawkweed, this plant called Hieracium. It was known for being tricky, lots of variation. Mendel, the botanist he corresponded with, was interested in it too.
And did hawkweed follow the same neat ratios as the peas?
No. That was the problem. His hawkweed results were confusing, they didn't fit his laws, and it became this puzzle he couldn't quite crack, even discussing it with Mendel.
So what was going on there?
We know now that many hawkweed species don't reproduce sexually in the normal way. They use something called apomixis. Essentially, they produce seeds asexually, they clone themselves.
So his laws of segregation and independent assortment wouldn't apply if there wasn't sexual reproduction happening.
Exactly. He was dealing with a different biological system without realizing it. It wasn't that his laws were wrong. The hawkweed just wasn't playing by those rules.
Okay, that makes sense. And he had other interests too, beekeeping.
He did. We mentioned his childhood interest. He kept bees at the abbey, different types like Cyprian and Carniolan.
And they weren't the friendliest bees.
Apparently not. Reports say they were quite aggressive, annoying the other monks and visitors, but Mendel supposedly called them "my dearest little animals." Sadly, whatever detailed records he kept of his bee breeding experiments haven't survived.
Dearest little animals, stinging everyone. Love it. What about mice? Did he breed mice? And did the abbot really stop him?
There are recollections from colleagues that he did breed mice, maybe looking at coat color or size variations, but again, no paper survived. The story about Abbot Knapp forbidding it because studying animal sex was improper for a hunk. The sources suggest that's likely a myth. Knapp himself oversaw sheep breeding at the abbey. It was also a working farm, remember?
Right, clears that up. And beyond biology.
Oh yeah. He was seriously into meteorology and astronomy. He published more papers on meteorology during his lifetime than on genetics. He even helped found the Austrian Meteorological Society in 1865.
So a real polymath, interested in quantitative observation across different fields.
Definitely. He was even recognized formally as a botanist for describing some new plant species. You'll see Mendel as the author abbreviation sometimes. He was much more than just the P guy.
Which makes this next chapter, the Mendelian paradox, even more fascinating. What's that about?
This came up much later, in 1936. The famous statistician R.A. Fisher took a hard look at Mendel's published P data, specifically those F2 generation ratios.
The 3-to-1 ratios. What did Fisher find?
He found they were, well, too good to be true, statistically speaking.
Too good. How can data be too good?
Think about it like coin flips. If you flip a coin 100 times, you expect 50 heads, 50 tails. But you'll probably get something slightly off, like 5248 or 4951, just due to random chance. Fisher argued that Mendel's results across all his experiments showed less of this expected random variation than they should have. They were consistently closer to the perfect theoretical ratios, like 3-to-1, than probability suggested they should be.
Okay, I see. So suspiciously perfect. And Fisher didn't mince words.
Not at all. The source uses terms he used like abominable, shocking. He basically concluded the data was cooked or falsified to fit the theory better.
Wow. That's a huge claim against the father of genetics. So that's the paradox. The numbers look fishy, but everything we know about Mendel's character suggests he wasn't a fraud.
Exactly. How do you reconcile that? So people have tried to explain it in a few ways.
Could Fisher have just been wrong with his statistics?
That's one argument. Researchers like Hartle and Fairbanks have reanalyzed it, suggesting maybe Fisher misunderstood parts of how Mendel ran the experiments. Or maybe Mendel counted more plants than he explicitly stated in the paper for certain ratios. Their view is that the results are statistically okay if you look closer, and Fisher's accusation of fraud can be dismissed.
Okay, so a statistical counterargument. What about unconscious bias?
That was Fisher's fallback if it wasn't deliberate fraud. Maybe Mendel, knowing what he expected, unconsciously classified borderline cases like a P that was sort of yellowish-green in the direction that fit his hypothesis. Confirmation bias, essentially. Some analyses still suggest the numbers are a bit too neat, even if not faked, pointing towards something like bias, or maybe he stopped counting experiments once the numbers looked good.
And then there's that other idea you mentioned that maybe he simplified things deliberately, but not necessarily to deceive.
Right. This is the idea that Mendel, as this unknown monk presenting totally radical ideas, might have felt he needed to present his data in the clearest, most compelling way possible. Maybe he omitted some confusing results, or presented subsets of data that showed the ratios most clearly just to make sure his revolutionary discovery wasn't dismissed because it looked messy.
So kind of curating the data to make the message land. A sort of noble lie for the sake of scientific progress.
It's a complex and debated idea. Was he just trying to be a good communicator? Or is he manipulating? It forces you to think about the pressures on scientists breaking new ground.
Is there any modern consensus on this paradox?
Well, a major reevaluation in a 2008 book involving several experts like Franklin, Edwards, Fairbanks, and Hartle looked at all the evidence again. They largely concluded there wasn't compelling evidence for deliberate falsification, and downplayed the strong confirmation bias arguments too, often pointing back to issues with Fisher's original statistical assumptions. So the trend seems to be away from accusing Mendel of fraud, though the statistical neatness remains a point of discussion.
Okay, so the debate might continue, but his overall legacy is secure.
Absolutely immense. You see his name everywhere. Mount Mendel, the Mendel Museum and Mendel University in Brno, even the Mendel Polar Station in Antarctica. His contribution is foundational.
And his story keeps intersecting with modern science, like that exhumation in 2021.
Yeah, quite recently. They analyzed his DNA, confirmed his height about 168 centimeters or 5'6", and even found genetic markers linked to the heart problems he suffered from. It connects the historical figure to modern biology.
And connecting back to the P traits again, that project finishing up now, identifying the very genes he studied. It's just incredible how relevant his work remains.
It really is. From that monastery garden, observing P's, he laid down the fundamental rules that underpin all of modern genetics and biotechnology.
So looking back, we see this picture of Mendel, someone from humble roots, overcoming obstacles to get educated, finding this unique niche in the monastery, doing this incredibly meticulous, groundbreaking work
That was decades ahead of its time, facing the disappointment of being ignored.
only to be rediscovered after his death and completely revolutionize biology. It's quite a story.
It's a testament to perseverance, careful observation, and maybe a bit of faith that Eventually, the truth would come out. His quantitative approach was just so different for biology back then.
And his story isn't static. We're still learning, still debating aspects of it.
Absolutely. It shows how science history is alive, constantly being re-examined.
And thinking about that Mendelian paradox, that whole debate about the perfect data, it really leaves you with something to chew on, doesn't it?
It does.
Imagine you're in his shoes. You've made this huge discovery. You know it's right, but it flies in the face of everything accepted at the time. Your data is almost perfectly clear, but maybe has a few messy edges, just like real data always does. Do you present every single outlier, every bit of noise, potentially confusing people and risking your discovery being dismissed?
Or do you feel a pull, maybe even a responsibility, to present it in the cleanest possible way, the way that best illustrates the underlying principle you've uncovered, to make sure the world gets the message?
It's a tough question about the human element in science, isn't it? Where does clear communication end and manipulation begin, especially when you believe you're revealing a fundamental truth?
Definitely food for thought about how science actually gets done.
It certainly is. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating life and enduring legacy of Gregor Mendel.